So in this portion of the presentation, we will hear directly from those who have the roles we just discussed. So it'll include a rape crisis center advocate, a law enforcement officer, a forensic nurse examiner, and a prosecutor. These individuals that we have with us today work on different sexual assault response teams throughout the state to help pursue this interdisciplinary and victim-centered response we talked about earlier today. I'm just going to begin with some introductions of our panelists, and then we will get into questions. If you have any questions outside of the ones that we have set for today for the panelists, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll kind of be semi-monitoring it, so I might miss things and we'll interrupt as needed to kind of address any questions that come up. But if we don't get to any questions dropped in the chat, I will be sure to forward them to the panelists so we can get an answer to your question. All right, so as I said before we begin, I just want to give a brief introduction from each of our panelists. So this panel includes, for the role of the Rape Crisis Center advocate, we have Shemaine Jones. She has been the sexual assault program manager for the Southern Maryland Center for Family Advocacy since 2018. She has been with the agency for 8 years, first as the district court advocate, which led to her creating the case management program in 2017. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Child and Adolescent Studies and a minor in psychology from Bowie State University. And she is now less than 8 months away from earning her Master of Social Work degree with one concentration in trauma and the other concentration in child and family. So thank you so much for being with us today. Next up for the role of the FNE, we have Stacy. So Stacy is the forensic nurse examiner for the University of Maryland Upper Chesapeake Health in Harford County, Maryland. She has been an emergency department nurse since 2008 and a forensic nurse examiner since 2018. She recently transitioned the forensic program to the Aberdeen Medical Center campus, which was recently opened in February 2024. So thank you, Stacy. We're super excited to have you today as well. Next up for the role of the prosecutor from the state's attorney's office, we have Mary Murphy. Mary is the chief of the Special Victims Unit in the Howard County State's Attorney's Office, where she has been a prosecutor for over 33 years. Ms. Murphy has primarily handled child abuse, sex offense, and domestic violence cases in her many years as a prosecutor. She has held leadership positions on the Maryland State Bar Association, including chair of both criminal law and litigation sections. Additionally, she has served on the Maryland Criminal Pattern Jury Instructions Committee. She also served on the board of directors for the Kidney Foundation of Maryland and the Trinity School. So thank you so much, Mary, for being with us today as well. And finally, for the role of the law enforcement officer, we have Jason Baum. So Jason has been a police officer for 30 years. He worked for the city of Pittsburgh Police from 1994 to 2004 and was a team leader and lead sniper for the SWAT team. In 2004, he left the Pittsburgh Police Department and joined the Montgomery County Police Department, and he was promoted to Detective Corporal in 2013 and joined the Special Victims Unit Division in Domestic Violence in 2015. He was promoted to Detective Sergeant and took over as supervisor of the Special Victims Investigation Division Sexual Assault Unit. So thank you so much, Jason, for being with us today as well. Just to give a rundown of how questions will go, I'm going to start with a general question for each of us. So for organization purposes, I will start with Stacy, I'll go to Mary, and then we'll go to Jason. Shemaine, some of your questions are more specific to advocate work. So when we get to you, I'll give you your question in a way that it's phrased so it's applicable to the work that you do. If you need any clarification or me to repeat any questions, just let me know. I'm happy to. And thank you so much to all of you again for being here today. We appreciate your time. So to start off, the first question is, what is it important for a victim advocate to know about your role in the sexual assault response process? So Stacy, we will start with you.
I don't think we can hear her I don't know if anyone else is having the problem.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was just me. Okay, sounds good.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, sorry, I had to change my microphone here. Um, but I think what patients typically experience with nursing, especially when you're in a hospital setting, is that your nurse forms a relationship with you, they care deeply about you. There's a rapport that's built in healthcare. And this role is a little different in that you don't want to make too much of that relationship with the patient. So we really lean on our advocates to make that relationship because we don't want our exam to be biased. We don't want any part of the evidence collection or the statement or any interview portion of our exam to be biased in any way. So unlike every other aspect of nursing, we try not to make that very close connection with them because I don't want to maybe see something that's not there or, um, I don't know, enhance my exam in any way. So we really lean on the advocate to make that connection with the patient. And we're there to do a job. I collect a statement, I collect evidence, I take photographs, I get you where you need to go. So I think from a nursing perspective, that can be a little different, but it's purposeful to protect ourselves and the patients later in the litigation process.
Thanks, Steve. So Mary, I will hand it over to you.
So our role comes into play typically sorry, can you hear me? Okay. When the case gets charged or is being investigated, depending on the nature of the alleged crime. We too have to maintain some distance in terms of trying to be professional and non-biased and non-judgmental when we're going into the case. So we do rely as well on our advocates, and we have in-house advocates that transition typically with the advocate from the hospital setting. And we rely on the advocates to provide resources so that the victim will stay on board and get help as they go through the process. We typically will meet with the victim after the investigation has been completed to determine whether or not to go forward. And depending on the type of case, sometimes we meet with them before we charge to talk about the facts of the case, and especially if the victim has been reluctant to go forward, either by starting the process as a Jane Doe or coming forward later and or having second thoughts about the case. Then we'll meet with them to talk to them about the process because we think it's really important for them to understand the process because they are the ones that would have to testify and go forward. And we find that by meeting early with them, then their questions are answered and they are able to proceed on a much higher basis, percentage basis. Our process is that we try to rely on the advocates to provide the support as we're going through the trial prep process and the trial process so that there's one person that they can talk to, not about the facts, but about their feelings, about everything else. And we're the ones that they discuss the facts with and prep the case for trial. We try to explain the process to them and what questions they will be asked. And we also prepare them for questions that the defense might ask of them at trial so that they're not walking into a courtroom not knowing what may be expected of them in terms of the questions, and they're not going to be surprised by a defense attorney by questions that they might ask. We also provide courtroom tours to tell them and show them where they'll sit, make them as comfortable as possible prior to going into the courtroom. Prior to any plea negotiation or discussion, we always try to meet with the victim and to explain to them the guidelines, to explain to them the strengths and the weaknesses of the case, and to get their input about a possible plea. Ultimately, I think it's important that we make it clear to the victims that we have to make the decision in terms of what's an appropriate plea offer, and to explain to them, that we want their input, we want to know what their goals and expectations are and what they would ultimately like to see happen. But we try to also make it clear to them that that burden is not on their shoulders. It's on the state's shoulders, as we are the ones who have to bring the prosecution. So that's sort of, and then we, of course, go into the courtroom and present the evidence, and work with the forensic nurse examiners to prep them for trial and to put them on, as well as the investigators in the case. And we go over the evidence with them, and put the trial together and all the evidence. So that's sort of a nutshell of what we do.
Thank you so much. Jason, I will hand it over to you. So what is important for a victim advocate to know about your role in the sexual assault response process?
Yes, so we, in most circumstances, have the most contact with the victim throughout the entire process. Depending on the victim's wishes, is kind of determined on how much contact we have with the advocates. There's some victims that, want to deal with us directly, speak with us directly, have all the information and the updates in their case come from us directly to them. And there's some times that they want us to interact with their advocate, who will then provide the information to the victim. So it's kind of determined solely based on the victim's wishes. There are times, obviously, these cases are very traumatic for the victims, and throughout our investigation and while we're collecting information and evidence, we may have to do follow-up interviews and have clarification questions with the victim. Sometimes those questions can be difficult conversations. So when we do have those types of conversations, which could be upsetting with the victim, or if we're unable to, move forward with, an arrest in a case, which does happen, those outcomes can be, very upsetting to the victim. So we make sure throughout the process that they are engaged with their advocates, that they do have advocacy contacts. And if they don't, we make sure that they get those resources. But then once we keep all of our victims updated throughout the entire process. We're open with them in the beginning that obviously we can't make any promises as to the outcome of the investigation, and that sometimes, depending upon the complexity of the case, our investigations could take months, if not longer, depending on what's needed throughout the investigation. But throughout that entire time, we stay in contact with the victims. We make sure that they have constant updates on where we are, where we stand within the investigative process.
Great, thank you so much. So Shemaine, my question for you is, how do you explain your role as an advocate to others in the response process or to the survivor?
So when I explain my role as an advocate, I usually start by letting everyone know that we are specifically here to support the survivor. Whatever the survivor needs, whatever resources they need, whether it's in-person support, whether it's court support, whatever it may be, we're here to support them. We also, more importantly, we educate the survivors and anyone that we come into contact with about our role. And like, again, I said, about supporting the survivor. We do act as a liaison for the survivor between whether it's the sheriff's department, the state's attorney's office, their advocates. But like I said, most importantly, we're here to support the survivor in whatever it is that they're concerned about. Like Jason said, sometimes they want to speak directly with an advocate or have an advocate present when they're meeting with law enforcement or the survivor. So again, whether it's for a protective order, the temporary, the final, if they want us there, we're going to be there to support and offer resources.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. So moving on to our second question, how do you work with victim advocates throughout the sexual assault response process? So this can include before, during, or after an exam, or during interviews, or any other sort of time you can think of. So Stacy, we will begin with you.
Sure. I think we have maybe the most intimate relationship with the victim advocate as a forensic nurse. We in Harford County at least have a very tight partnership. So I usually engage the advocate before I even go to the hospital and have them come in with me at the same time so that they can start to build that rapport with the patient before we even do the exam. The relationship used to be we would offer an advocate if the patient wanted it or not. We have now moved to a model where we call the advocate every single time. It's not a if, it's a 100% service. So anyway, I would say that I usually give them some kind of report about the patient. I think most of our forensic programs are happening in an emergency department setting. Most of our hospital setting that we're doing this. So for a safety perspective, I do like to make sure that the advocate feels safe. There's a lot going on. Sometimes there's mental health issues with these patients. Sometimes there's substance issues with these patients, depending on the case, and everyone is different. There's family issues, a lot going on in this period of crisis right here in the beginning. Usually law enforcement's involved, or not at that point, but I would say we get to the hospital at the same time. We kind of figure out what's going on. I usually have the advocate in the room before I even go, start the exam process. We're getting the room ready. I'm kind of starting to get consent and all this information, and the advocate's really building that relationship. So they're giving me crucial information before the exam even starts, like, hey, I think we have some social issue here, or hey, I think we have X, Y, Z. We're really partnering and starting to think about discharge planning, because the exam takes about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and then the other 3 or 4 hours after that is all evidence, procurement or whatever, we're packaging things up. That actually takes longer. All the paperwork part, the exam itself doesn't take very long, so we have a very short window of time together. So we're partnering with each other for information sharing. I always use them in lieu of any family member unless the patient requests it, to do the exam with me. So our advocate is in the room probably 99% of the time now, so they can help witness my exam, so I'm not alone with the patient. And also it limits the patient feeling uncomfortable about saying some really intense things in front of their family. We have a questionnaire that we use. Maybe 5 or 6 programs use the same questionnaire now, but it is very detailed questions, and so you want somebody in that room that's unbiased, not a family member. You're not saying things that you would have had to do, which can be embarrassing sometimes, I think, for patients, or make them feel shameful and things like that. So anyway, it's nice to have a trained individual in there. So we prep before, we do the exam together, and then usually I kind of leave the advocate with the patient after the exam, because I'm over here packing evidence up, and they're really now taking over and doing that discharge plan. Do they have some safe place to go? Are there financial issues? Whatever it is, and they kind of really take over from there. I'll come back in and loop in later for medications, their medical portion of the discharge, but the advocate's really kind of taking over emotionally and post-discharge planning from there. If there's any questions later, I'll usually touch base with the advocate. Hey, is there anything that I missed? Or, we kind of debrief afterwards. Is there anything that you think I could have done better? We help each other professionally develop as well. Hopefully that answers that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Stacey. So Mary, I will pass it over to you.
Sure. In our jurisdiction, a lot of times we don't have the immediate access to the advocate who responds to the hospital. Typically that happens when we're not present and involved in the process. Where we would have the contact typically with the safe advocate would be if there is pass over from the advocacy being performed for the victim to the prosecution process and the investigative process as it's a decision-making process of going forward. As Jason indicated, sometimes these cases are more complicated and do require a lot more investigation, particularly if we're waiting on a DNA analysis. Our jurisdiction sends it out to outside lab, so it takes typically 2 months to get the results on a rush, which is tough sometimes. But that transition occurs, and our advocate in our office then will set up meetings and assist in getting resources along with the hospital advocate. So it's a transition type of a communication, I think, and that happens between the advocates and our office. And occasionally we'll have the direct contact with the hospital advocate, but then once our advocate gets that baton passed to them, they work very closely with the victim to make sure that the resources are there and to be the conduit for the communication, whether it be for the outcome of the results, those types of things, and waiting for the decision on the prosecution, and then scheduling all of the meetings and giving the updates on the process for the court.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. So Jason, we'll go to you.
Yeah, so it used to be here that it was law enforcement's responsibility to contact the advocates when we were notified that there was a victim at a hospital getting an exam. Like Stacy was saying, that's changed now. We primarily use Shady Grove Hospital, and the advocates are now called directly by the forensic nurse examiners at Shady Grove. Also, when I get the reports, I assign the cases out to the detectives. My case assignments and the police reports also get sent to our victim advocates, just as a fail safe to make sure that our advocates are notified that we have a victim, and then they get our case assignments and they reach out to make sure that victim was connected with an advocate and they have the resources that they need. We generally don't have, at least in the beginning of the process, a lot of contact with the advocates. There may be times where, our paths cross at the hospital. We'll introduce ourselves, and speak to the advocate, or to see if they have any concerns or anything that we know about before we go in and meet with the victim. We try to keep the advocates out of the investigative process so they don't become witnesses in our case. So we try to do our interviews without having the advocate in the room. But again, it's dependent upon the victim. We do sometimes have cases, it's not very often, but we do sometimes have cases where the victim really wants an advocate in the room with them. And in those cases, it's more important for us, for the victim to feel comfortable and feel open to speaking with us. So in those cases, we'll obviously bring the victim in, but we do try to keep that aspect of it separate, and then just communicate with the advocate and provide them with any information that they may need in order to better support the victim. But again, this is all determined upon the needs of the victim, and that's what's most important for us throughout the whole process.
Thank you so much. So Shemaine, my question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your work with victims and other professions before, during, or after sexual assault forensic exam?
So we have two ways that we're contacted through our crisis line, but I can't say two ways, but we might, and most often we're contacted through the emergency room, the forensic nurse or whoever's on call that night. They will call our crisis line, give us a little bit of background information, and we'll all meet at the hospital for the exam. Sometimes the exam has to be scheduled for a little bit later in the day if we don't have a nurse on call at the moment or at the hospital to complete the exam. Other times we're contacted directly through law enforcement after they have gotten the case and kind of been made aware of what's going on. I prefer to get the call and go straight to the hospital. I actually responded to 2 this morning, so I am beyond exhausted right now. And they were both pretty, I can't say difficult, but they were both under the influence. So we had to wait a little bit, kind of wait until they sobered up some, and then we could continue the process. So I still have somebody at the hospital right now that we're working with. But for the most part, I halfway forgot the question. I have it here, so let me get back to it. So like I said, that's how we're contacted before. During the exam, we're there. We're there to let them know that whatever they need, we're gonna let me go back to my notes. I'm all over the place right now. So okay, so like I said, we're there to advocate for them. We're there to act as a liaison. We're providing accompaniment. We interact with whatever agency we need to. So whether that's the ER staff, if there needs to be sheltered after the incident, after they're done at the hospital, providing transportation. Honestly, it's just whatever they might need. So like case management that day, whether it's case management 2 weeks from that day, accompaniment to social services. We even go, if they need to apply for services anywhere, we're normally there to support them, kind of walk them through the process. Whether it's applying for victims compensation, you name it. So, sometimes I work with the client from that very day until about 6 months later. So even if the case extends or the trial extends to a year later, which we've had happen before, we're there the entire time. Even with law enforcement, even with the state's attorney's office, here in Southern Maryland, we're kind of just now getting advocates in the state's attorney's office. So we can pass the baton to them. Usually, because we've built such a close relationship with the survivor, they prefer to still have us involved. So it's whatever they need. We're always going to be there. Sometimes I try to say, here, it's okay. You can go ahead and talk to this person. I trust them. But again, if they want us there, and I run this program by myself, so it's usually just me by myself handling every single client that comes through the program. The relationship that we have with law enforcement, I agree with Jason. I prefer to not be in the room for the interviews, but there has been one instance and it was okay, but of course, like I don't want to be called in to testify for anything, So it happened to work out. The case did go to trial. The offender was found guilty, and we kind of just helped her move forward from there. Therapy is always offered free of cost. Obviously, nothing. We don't charge for anything, whether it's a cell phone, you name it, we're going to provide it. Financial support afterwards if they're in a bad situation. So and then out in the community, we're always doing outreach, educating our departments, whether it's individuals from the college, the local colleges, whatever they're even our local base. We do outreach and prevention there as well. And then we work with those clients who are not active military, but things have happened or they've been assaulted by a military member, which I'm not even going to get into that. That's a whole different situation, but that's the gist of it for me.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Okay, so moving on to our next question. What should a victim advocate be able to explain to a survivor about your role in the sexual assault response process? So some things that you could touch on are things like confidentiality, number of times victims are typically interviewed, or things relating to mandated reporting. So Stacey, we'll start with you.
Okay. I think when I get to speak to the patient, I'm going over what the exam entails. They can take that in, but all the other details, because there's so many and they're kind of in crisis mode when we're with them, I think it's hard to take in. So we really rely on our advocates to kind of go over some of the other information, such as this is a confidential service. You will not get a bill for this in the mail. This is a free service. Some of those things come up like, oh, am I, especially for minors, and are my parents going to get a bill in the mail? Things that are they're worried about reporting because they are worried about the downstream. So it's really important for them to, our advocates, to kind of reiterate some of those things, because they're not taking that in when I'm talking to them. They're worried about what's going to happen in this next hour or so in this room. So I think it's really important to explain, the confidentiality, the free service, some of the mandated reporting situation. Obviously, if you're 13 or older, just knowing that information to be able to answer some of those questions. If you're 13 and older, you can come in and have these services confidentially, unless it is a caregiver that is involved. Then we do have a duty to report. But other than a caregiver involvement, if I'm 13 and I met a friend and this happened, again, that's their choice whether they want to report or not. So I think just knowing some of those things and being able to answer some of those questions before we get in there is really important. And then I think a lot of patients are anxious about the process itself. So just understanding what is a forensic exam, what is going to happen, and that will come with experience and time. But I think being able to answer some of those questions for patients and just saying, you're going to have this exam, but you're allowed to refuse any portion of the exam. It is your exam to have. So if there's something you don't want to do or aren't comfortable with, you don't have to. This is that, just reiterating that the patient is the driver is really important from my perspective. And I'll let Mary take over from there.
So from my perspective, I guess the advocates would benefit by knowing and hearing what the process is. And typically, in each jurisdiction, they'll handle it differently. So whatever jurisdiction you're in, become familiar with how their process works. Typically in our jurisdiction, we work very closely with the law enforcement, and if it's going to be an on-scene arrest based on the exigency or the facts of the case, then we're going to have a much sooner contact with the victim than we would if it were a case where there was an exam and then there was going to be an extensive examination. But at some point there will be a review of the case and determination, if it's not an on-scene arrest, whether or not charges would be brought. And regardless of whether we bring charges or not bring charges, we always offer the victim a meeting regarding that decision. What we typically do in our jurisdiction is to bring in the victim after charges have been filed and it goes to the grand jury, and have what's known as a meet and greet meeting, where we simply meet with the victim, have that contact, and make sure that they understand what the process is that will go forward from the charging, the different court dates that they will get notification of, what they'll be needed to come to, what they don't, and not get into the facts of the case the first time that we meet, because we're trying to build that rapport that the advocate probably already has, but that here's yet one more person. And before we do an interview with the victim to go over the facts, typically we've looked at the body-worn camera, the recorded interview that's already occurred. So, we'll have all that information, and they can be assured that we will have reviewed all of that before we meet with them, so that they don't have to, in that first meeting, go into any details other than, to get to know them, to see how they are doing in the process, and to gauge whether they need additional resources, and talk to them about what resources might be needed and what we can do to help. Then, that they will be prepped by the prosecutor to go to court, and that they will be prepared for both the questions that they will be asked and the questions by the state, but also questions that they would be asked by the defense, so that they're not going in cold to the courtroom. And that the prosecutors will describe what the process will be like, how long the process can be anticipated, because that can depend on the type of case that it is, and how many days it would be, and explaining to them that they're not going to be there testifying for 5 days, that their piece is discreet, and that we will include them in decision making, and try to come to a decision what's best for them, number one. And I think that's the most important thing for the advocates to know about our role. Jason?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things actually. So It's important for the victims to know that just because they file a police report and we begin an investigation doesn't mean that we're then going to force them to continue and move forward with this investigation. A victim at any time can make a decision that they want to stop the investigation or pause the investigation because they're feeling uncomfortable with it. And that's completely okay with us. If they contact us and say, hey, I don't want to go forward, we stop right there. We don't move forward with anything. And then they're free to contact us again at any time when they feel more comfortable or they feel ready to continue the investigation. And then we'll pick up where we left off. There isn't a statute of limitations for our cases. So if they want to stop and they contact us, a year later, 5 years later, we pick up right where we left off and continue on. It's important for the victims to know the reality of these investigations. We get a lot of victims that will contact us, a day after we get the report, 2 days after we get the report, and want updates on their cases, and has an arrest been made yet. And the reality is that, it just in Montgomery County, we get on average 280 cases per year. And I currently have 2 detectives and myself. So the reality is that at any given time, each one of my detectives has, 14, 15 active cases that they're working. So updates, what they would expect, or the time frame that they would expect to have updates, might not match the reality of what we're able to do, because we have so many active cases that we are currently working. So these cases can take, a lengthy amount of time. And then when you're talking about DNA, if we don't make an arrest on a case, and we're waiting for DNA to come back because we need that part of the evidence to give us the probable cause in the case, that could take upwards of 6 to 8 months just because of the backlog right now. We always maintain the victim's anonymity. We do not put our victims' names in any search warrants. We don't put their names in any arrest documents. So none of those things, or that, outside entities can get a hold of, would have the victim's information in it. We simply identify them as victim A. When we speak to the suspects in the case, that's where, unfortunately, the victim's identity can't be kept anonymous, because, we have to establish the fact that the victim and our suspect were in the same place, were engaged in this conduct. So the suspect is going to know what this case is about when we get to that step where we interview them. But again, we take every step that we can to maintain their anonymity from any outside people that are not involved in the investigation. And then throughout the process, of course, if, anything comes up where they start to feel unsafe, we ask that they contact 911 first, but they relay all that information to us so that we can take steps to ensure their safety throughout the investigation as well.
Thank you so much. So Shameen, my question for you is, how do you explain the role of a forensic nurse examiner, law enforcement officer, or prosecutor to a survivor?
So I'll start with the forensic nurse examiner. I usually start by letting them know that this is the person who is going to conduct the exam, and with keeping in mind that this is not someone investigating the case, but that they may have to explain a little bit about what happened to them so that they can properly do the exam. So that means like checking for bruises, taking pictures, things like that. I want them to know that important evidence is collected by the forensic nurse examiner, and that, like I said, they're checking for injuries, offering medications that are important, and that all of the work that they're doing is coming from a trauma-informed place. So they're trauma-informed, and they're considering what has happened to them and how it's a traumatic experience. So again, they're not investigating, but they have to know what happened to you in order to do a proper exam. Of course, I'm missing a couple of things here that I normally say. I can't even think of my normal spiel that I give them. But with law enforcement, I do stress that they're going to have to ask the hard questions and that it may be uncomfortable, which is why I offer them therapy right away. And I try to get them in with the therapist almost immediately, not the next day, but, we'll give them a couple of days to kind of get settled, kind of process some of these things before they have to meet with the detective and, kind of go through this experience all over again. With the state's attorneys, I kind of let them know, or the prosecutor, that yes, you're going to have to kind of talk about this stuff all over again, that they'll have some of the notes from the investigators from law enforcement, but in order to prosecute, they're going to have to ask some of those questions again and kind of prepare you for what's next when it comes to a trial. That's usually the gist of it for me. I kind of usually arrange a meeting with the detective or the advocates from the state's attorney's office to kind of let them do their part, just so they can get familiar with the process and, just who they'll be meeting with and who they're going to have supporting them besides myself or my agency.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question is for all of you. So there's no specific advocate question, but from your perspective, what do you think is important for survivors to know about anonymous exams? Stacey, we'll start with you.
I think a lot of these points were made, but just to know what the information is, I think it's most important in the hospital setting just to give people that option, because I think that there is sometimes a barrier to report. So if that option is on the table, someone might be more eager to have the exam done, or even a portion of the exam, whatever it is, if they know that they have that choice. So I think leading with that is really important in the hospital setting, just as an option if they're not willing to report right away, and just knowing that we can still do everything exactly the same. They can get the full exam, they can get the medicines, they can see an ER doc, they can all the things. It's exactly the same. We just don't attach their name to it until later when they're ready. I think it's also important. A lot of patients think that they can have the exam and it still goes to the crime lab if they don't report, and that's not the case. We're not running those kits. So I think that is probably the number one question I get in the hospital setting is, I'll decide to report whenever the DNA comes back. And that's just really not an option. So that's probably one of the main things they need to know.
Thank you. Mary, we'll hand it to you.
Well, typically I don't ever know or have a communication because at that point we're not involved. But I guess what would be helpful from a prosecution perspective regarding the anonymous exams for advocates to know is that, we don't get involved until somebody decides, as Jason indicated, that they want to go forward. What I think is so important, though, is if there could be the emphasis on the fact that the exam would remain anonymous until they're ready to go forward, because I worry that too many people don't report because they're afraid to have their name out there. And obviously, the best evidence oftentimes comes from the safe exam. And if we miss that opportunity, then the prosecution becomes much less viable. So it's really important for people to understand that, and if the victims are willing to have the anonymous exam done to preserve that evidence, that would be great. But I agree with Stacey in terms of the misunderstanding that their test will be submitted for DNA under anonymous things. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Jason, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, so for when a victim goes in and has an anonymous exam, obviously that evidence, at least for our jurisdiction, we collect that evidence from the hospital. There's no identifying information on any of the evidence, but we collect it and it's stored in our evidence room until if there becomes a time when the victim decides that they do want to go forward with an investigation, we have that evidence and then we can switch it over to an active investigation. One of the things our department provides, and to the best of my knowledge, we're, if not the only, one of the only departments in the nation that do this. We're actually going to be presenting on it at the next AVAWI conference. But our department provides anonymous consultations with detectives for Jane Does at the hospital. So it's an option that's provided to them by the forensic nurse examiner. The victim is asked if they would like to have an anonymous consultation with a detective. And if they choose that option, we're on call 24/7. So whoever the on-call detective is that day, the hospital will then contact the detective and say, we have a victim who would like an anonymous consultation with the police. And so they'll put us on the phone with them, and then that victim can ask us any questions they want about the investigative process, what's involved in it. To answer any of those questions that may help them make a decision on whether or not they do want to go forward with an investigation. So, we've been doing this for about 3 years, and we found there were a lot of times that victims were reporting as Jane Does because of their fear in the investigation, or not knowing exactly what was involved. So by them being able to speak to us directly and ask us whatever questions they might have, helps them to make a more informed decision there at the hospital on whether or not they want to remain a Jane Doe. We don't ask them any questions. We tell them up front, the answers that I'm going to give you are somewhat generic because we don't know anything involved in their case. But we try to answer as best we can any questions that they might have about the entire process.
Thank you so much. Shanae, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so basically everything everyone else just said, but we do let them know that it will remain confidential and that it will be stored at our local sheriff's department. That's just where our kids are stored at, and that no one's going to reach out to them. It will have a tracking number, so it will not say their name, first name, last name, initials, nothing. It'll just be a number associated with the kit, and that there is also a tracking system, and that they will be notified before the kit is destroyed. And then also we want them to know that the advocacy services are still there. So if you still want services, you still want support in any way, we're absolutely there to support you. But other than that, those are the main things and some of the main questions that they have when we speak to someone who has submitted an anonymous kit. I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So moving on to our final question. This is once again geared towards all of you. So in your opinion, what do you consider the most beneficial aspect of sexual assault response teams, both for your profession or organization and for survivors? So Stacey, we'll start with you.
I think the response team itself, we meet regularly as a whole team, including MCASA, our local law enforcement, our state's attorney, everybody. We meet probably quarterly, I would say, from used to. Not as much this year, but I think just having that collaborative effort helps with continuity of care for the patient. So they're, we all know each other. We can kind of communicate with one another. There's continuity along this process with them. And I think us being familiar with one another and having that close relationship, we're very tight knit in Harford County, at least. It's really nice because I can kind of like talk up the next person, like, oh, this detective is awesome. Like, you're gonna, this is going to be great, or the district attorney you're working with is amazing. And, I think being able to talk up that next provider to the patient helps them feel like they have some confidence in what's going to be happening with their case and what's going on, and makes them have some kind of level of comfort with, the different handoffs that are happening, because it's quite a few between all of us, all of our hands in the pot.
Thank you. Mary, I'll hand it to you.
I would agree. I think the best part about the SART team response is to have that camaraderie and the ability to share information confidentially across the board, and to have the contacts to be able to pick up the phone and say, look, nurse examiner, can you help us out on this? Can you help us interpret this as we're getting ready for trial? Or to the advocate or responding person, we're having difficulty finding resources through our office and our advocates. Can you help us out here with housing resources or therapy resources? So it's really a victim-focused group of people who recognize that we depend on one another and we work with one another, and each person has their important piece of the process, and being able to come together in a room, we do it every other month, it is really important to be able to recognize issues, to share information. For instance, some of the things I've learned here today that other jurisdictions are doing, I'll be bringing back to my SART team to say, have we thought about doing it this way? We just want to, it's an opportunity for us to focus on the victims and to provide the best services across the board to victims in a cohesive manner. So it's I think a very helpful way of providing the best we can for our victims. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Jason, we'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, so I agree with what everybody's said already, and I won't reiterate everything. The one thing I can say from my perspective, or from the law enforcement perspective, and it's no secret that in the past, law enforcement hasn't done a very good job with working these cases. We've gotten a lot better. We're continuing to get better, but one of the important parts with SART is being able to hear from the other people that we collaborate with on what we can do better, how we can do things better, how we can continue to grow and meet the needs of the victims on the law enforcement side.
Thank you so much. And Shemaine, we'll leave it to you to conclude.
Same. So, I was already working for the agency when I took over the sexual assault services, and we had to create this program from scratch because another agency had it and kind of just didn't do anything with it. So one of the most important things for me was to make sure that all of the agencies that support sexual assault survivors in Southern Maryland are able to communicate with each other. At first, it was all over the place. You didn't know who to contact. You didn't know what to do or which direction to go to. But since having the SART meeting and establishing those connections, we know what to do. There's never a moment where you're like, oh, who do I contact for this? Or what do I do now? We communicate very well together, and, having our SART meeting every other month, it just helps everyone stay on the same page. If there's ever a question, if we're not calling anyone out, but hey, this could have been done differently. We're all there to support each other. So the interagency collaboration has just went from nothing to this beautiful process. And I'm proud to say that because I had a little bit of doubt in the beginning. And anyone from MCASA that has helped us get this program together would understand where we were and how much progress we've made. So just like everyone else, it just feels great to know that you have support in other departments and other areas to help survivors.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your answers and your expertise and everything like that. We really, really appreciate all of your time. So thank you again so much for being our panelists for today. We appreciate it.